we used to do. I mean, worry about the radio, because they're working on that. But they cannot mess with the drum. They're afraid of the drum, terrified. We're going to bring on our brother, Omali Yeshitela, and Brother Tapvideo commence to bring it on.
To Brother Maddox and the leadership of the United African Movement, sisters and brothers, uhuru. Uhuru is Swahili for freedom. And in our movement that's known as the Uhuru movement, it is a word of greeting. When we see each other in the morning, we go uhuru. When we separate from each other, we go uhuru. If you call our office at any time, day or night, the phone will be answered with uhuru. And we say uhuru because we think that freedom is something that should be on the minds of African people 24 hours a day. And this episode that we're currently enduring, what appears to be the never-ending story with this so-called presidential election, is clear evidence that freedom is something that should be on the minds of African people 24 hours a day. I think that this is an incredibly significant time, an important time for us. In many ways, we couldn't wish for a better period than what it is that we are experiencing now. One reason I think it's an important time is that we get an opportunity to mention Florida, to recognize Florida. The reason that's important is because for a long time, a lot of folk, even Africans living in other places in the United States, have not recognized that there's a resistance, a struggle happening in Florida. And that's because Florida, despite the fact that it's in the South, didn't seem to experience much of a civil rights movement. So that people knew about Mississippi and Alabama and what was happening in Georgia, but Florida was the place where you heard maybe about alligators and occasional rockets going up and sunny beaches. But seldom did Africans understand that there was serious struggle, serious resistance happening in Florida. And there's a history of struggle and resistance in the state of Florida, just as it is everywhere we exist as an African people. Fact of the matter is that the history and resistance is so significant in the state of Florida that it is precisely why I'm able to be here talking with you on the day. On October 24th, 1996, about 3 blocks from our office in St. Petersburg, Florida, 2 cops pulled over an 18-year-old African youngster. His name was Tyrone Lewis. Still had baby fat in his face. And they jumped out of their cars with their guns drawn and demanded that he get out of the car, screaming. A woman, Sandra Minor, and a white man named James Knight. And apparently Tyrone Lewis didn't get out of the car fast enough. And so the woman used a club and broke the glass in the back of the window, the glass in the window in the back of the car. And James Knight stood in front of the car and he fired 3 times and he killed 18-year-old Tyrone Lewis. And because it was 3 blocks away from our office, members of our organization were quick to be on the scene, as were all kinds of police backup. You know, when they kill one of us, right? They bring the entire department down in anticipation that we might respond to that. And this was in broad daylight, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And shortly after the backup got there, and because members of the Uhuru movement were on the ground helping to explain to the people what had happened and what the police represent in our community, within a very short period of time, there was first hand-to-hand combat between the people and the police that elevated to a much higher level, so that police cars were burned, 2 police precincts were burned, and various other institutions that represent the oppression of our people, including a white furniture store that had been in our community forever, charging like 29% interest on furniture, that after the furniture's worn out, you're still paying for furniture that you can't use anymore. Burn that down too. Burn down liquor stores. And when this happened, immediately the government and the media began to say that it was we, the Uhuru movement, that started the rebellion. But we didn't shoot Tyrone Lewis. Police shot Tyrone Lewis, cut him down, 18 years old. And what they do, of course, immediately after they kill him, the next day in the newspaper, they run a picture, a mugshot. A mugshot. Because it's hard to grow up as an African man in this country and not have a record. And so they run a mugshot of an 18-year-old and say that he had a criminal record. And, but they don't show the picture of his mama and his sisters and brothers who will miss Tyrone Lewis. And they can't show the pain that is inflicted upon a community that's seen too many young Africans die just because somebody thought they should die. And so there was a rebellion, and we were blamed for it. Now, they don't particularly care about killing an African, and they don't particularly care about a rebellion. They'll pay the price. I mean, they'll come and clean up. Look at Los Angeles. Look at Miami, Overtown, Liberty City. 2 or 3 rebellions in a row for 2 or 3 years in a row. And but that's all right. They can come in, they can put the rebellion down, and then business as usual. But this time it wasn't business as usual. And this time they were concerned because they had a rebellion that didn't just burn down police precincts, didn't just randomly commit violence, but also it was a rebellion that clearly had political consciousness. And so they targeted the Uhuru movement because of that. And they targeted us because it wasn't over after rebellion, because the next day we organized demonstrations against the police department, and the next day we were holding tribunals and putting the mayor and the police department on trial, and the community came out and testified. People who saw Tyrone Lewis cut down in the streets testified about what they had seen. And when they had a funeral that the mayor was supposed to speak to, where they were going to show somehow how young Tyrone Lewis was supposed to have died for the good of the city, when they had their funeral in the church, we had a funeral outside the church. We had the mobilizations, the demonstrations, and they were faced with a situation that they could not contend with. So, on November 13th, they were supposed to bring back a verdict from a grand jury. The grand jury was to have determined whether James Knight, the cop, the killer cop, had committed a crime when he shot 18-year-old Tyrone Lewis down. That was on a Wednesday, just like this Wednesday. And that was also the day that we have our regular Wednesday meetings, just like this Wednesday meeting. And we had also put out a leaflet asking the community to come out, because we were going to talk about the verdict, because we knew what the verdict was going to be even before they announced it. Didn't we? You weren't there. You know what the verdict was. And so about 2:30 in the afternoon, our meeting starts at 6:30, but 2:30 in the afternoon, 30 armed thugs, SWAT team, camouflage uniform, gas masks tied to their hip, special weapons team, pulled over right outside our office a young African, 30 of them, said he had an expired license plate. And clearly what was going on is they were attempting to provoke a military confrontation so that they could wipe out the leadership of our movement. And then when the police came, hundreds of African people came around our office and watching what the police were doing, because the people were waiting for this verdict as well. And the police had determined that they didn't want us to be able to communicate to our people, so they were going to start locking us up. And then they came to provoke this violence at our center. So the police riding up and down in front of our center, 4 in a car, doors open, shotguns out of the window, and the people stood on both sides of the streets watching them ride up and down and on the sidewalks. These were really tough guys. And then at 6 o'clock, they blocked off the sidewalks, blocked off the streets to both directions coming to our center, the Uhuru House, threatened people with arrest if they should come to the center. But there were already about 100 people there already. Some of them were babies and other children, women, men, in the center. At 6:30, I took the podium just like now and began to speak to the people as the cops were running amok outside. And someone came to the podium and said, the police have just said we have 5 minutes to get out the building, our building. We own the building. That they have declared this meeting an unlawful assembly. And then 30 seconds later, they began to shoot tear gas into the building. Women screaming, trying to find their children, their babies. People panicking, trying to get out of the place. Running to the back only to find out that we've surrounded, the entire building is surrounded. We were to later learn there were 300 cops from various organizations from St. Petersburg and neighboring cities as well as the Florida Highway Patrol. And the National Guard was 3 or 4 blocks down in an auditorium in a stadium on alert. They began to shoot tear gas canisters at the place. We closed the place off with tear gas in it. They shot tear gas in the trees behind the building, setting the trees on fire. The young people in the community would run and literally break the branches from the trees to try and put the fire out, and the cops would shoot tear gas canisters at them as they tried to put the branches out. They shot tear gas canisters on the top of the building to try to set the building afire. They sent at least 1 small airplane and a helicopter. Sounds like Philadelphia, doesn't it, Sister Cheryl? They used all the tear gas that they had in the city of St. Petersburg against that building on that day. They intended to kill the leadership of our movement on that day. And then the community rose up, and with bricks and bottles and automatic weapons, they shot down a helicopter, they wounded 2 cops, and they chased 300 cops out of the African community. And because of that, I'm able to be here with you on tonight, some years later, right? And we won some other significant political victories there. William Jefferson Clinton, that white man that you love so much, you call him the first black president. William Jefferson Clinton sent in Henry Cisneros, who was then the Secretary of HUD, sent him into St. Petersburg. We had a mayor, his name was David Fisher. And Fisher had said he'd never sit down with Omali Yeshitela. Never, 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 he said. And Cisneros came in because Clinton was concerned, as many elements of the ruling class were concerned about what was happening in St. Petersburg, because it was a rebellion that had consciousness. It wasn't just some kind of random looting and violence. It had political consciousness, and it scared them to death. So that Clinton sent somebody in there because he didn't want the St. Petersburg incident to contaminate the body politic of this country, right? And so Cisneros got there and he told all of them, he went before the city council publicly and said, what you better do is meet with Omali Yeshitela. And David Fisher, who would never sit down with Omali Yeshitela, thought that he'd better sit down with Omali Yeshitela. And we won some significant political victories in that city since then. But the resistance continues, the struggles continues, and I'm not here to try and let you believe that we've won any greater victories there than what has been won here. The point that I would make is that the resistance is happening in Florida, and there's more going on in Florida than what you've been hearing about lately in terms of this election. Another reason that is, I think that this is an important time is because this presidential election in particular gives us an opportunity to understand some things about where we are in our struggle, gives us an opportunity to revisit the past in a way that we can make a connection with what is happening to us now. It's truly important for us to understand this, and I just want to talk to you about it a little bit, because people are having this discussion above our heads as though we are not even factors here. They want to act like this presidential election and what's happening with it is just revolving around certain kinds of technicalities. Whether they got good or bad voting equipment, whether a shad is pregnant or has been penetrated at all, right? These are the kinds of questions that they would pretend is the issue. Whether or not the stay by the Supreme Court just made it impossible for them to rectify the voting question in the state of Florida. But I contend that the issue is not about Bush or Gore or about the Democrats or the Republicans. The issue is about our struggle, us as a people. We are the issue. And I would just like to say just a couple of things about that. And to talk about it, you know, there was another time, another incident. This is almost exactly what happened in 1876. This is almost exactly what happened in 1876. And I want to talk to you about 1876. I want to talk to you about that because, you know, 1876, that was just 11 years after the end of the Civil War. 11 years after the formal ending of slavery. All right? And at this time, because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, and the party that had led this Civil War that resulted in the end of slavery, African people identified with the Republican Party. We were Republicans then. And when we voted, and we did vote briefly. We voted as Republicans. Now, as I mentioned, this was 11 years after the formal ending of slavery. But you know, of course, that the Civil War was not fought for the emancipation of African people. It had to do with economic contradictions that existed inside this country. And slavery was an economic factor as far as they were concerned that would contend with this developing financial capital, industrial capital, all of which came as a consequence of black labor, right? So even the industrial and financial capitalists in the North had been made rich by the African labor in the South and throughout this country. And for a long time, you know, the war started in 1861. 61. And, but it was 1863 before the Emancipation Proclamation was put forward. By this time, Africans had started freeing ourselves. As whenever it looked like federal troops were close enough, a whole bunch of Africans would just leave. Sometimes didn't leave, just refused to work for the white man anymore. There were stories in some plantations where the Africans would be in the slave quarters, right, refusing to work, and began to build gallows, began to build hanging nooses. And the white people, slave owners, slave masters, began to be nervous about this. And Africans just quit working and started doing their own thing. And so it began to, among other things, undermine the war efforts of the South. And it became a question, the emancipation became an issue that contributed to the victory by the North over the South because with the Emancipation Proclamation, it just created this whole unstable force. White folks couldn't even stay in, couldn't even go off the war because the Africans were on the plantations leaving, refusing to work, and threatening to do violence to the women, white women and children who were left in charge of the plantations. And so it became necessary for them to issue this thing called the Emancipation Proclamation. But the Republican Party itself was not united even on whether Africans should have the vote once the Emancipation Proclamation was made. There was huge struggles among the Republicans. The one line from them had determined, and this was something that was put in effect in some place, I think initially in Louisiana, that, or it might have been in one of the Carolinas, that Africans could become emancipated, paid for their labor, so to speak, but stuck on the same plantations, right, that we were enslaved on. You couldn't quit. You couldn't quit your job. You just stuck there forever. This is what some of our Republican friends, these are our friends, the Republicans, right? And going into the election of 1876, a huge debate throughout this country revolved around the issue of African freedom and revolved around the question of Reconstruction, because the South now was being reconstructed to be allowed to come back into the Union. But in order for that to happen, the South, the white people, had to prove their loyalty to the Union. And so you had a situation where the South was occupied by federal troops. And in some instances, Africans were even elected to Congress. We were in state legislatures. We were among those who went to the state constitutional conventions because the southern states had to rewrite their constitutions in order to come back into the Union. Africans played a fundamental role in that. Public education, as you know it, emerged and developed during this period as a consequence of Africans being in the government then, you see. But huge debates revolved around this issue. And the white folks wanted to be able to run their lily white governments again. It was the Civil War that created the national state as it exists today. Before the Civil War, state actually felt free to more or less do their own things. At the end of the Civil War, the federal government was the largest employer in this country. It had become an overseer of the entire apparatus, and the states were made subordinate to the federal government for the first time. When you hear white folk talking about big government, that's how they say it, big government, right? And states' rights, they're talking about what existed before the Civil War and the emancipation of African people. That's what they want to have again. That's what they are fighting for again. But anyway, when we go into the election of 1876, this whole question of the emancipation of African people is a fundamental question. Lincoln has been killed, and his vice president was a white man from where? Tennessee. Name was Andrew Johnson. And Johnson quickly moved to undermine any assumptions of them 40 acres and all these other rights that African people were supposed to get. And it wasn't just Johnson. Lincoln himself was a right-winger in the Republican Party when it came to rights for African people. So there was a whole debate in the entire country among the white folks about what to do with African people and how to allow the other white people to come back into the federal government. So the election of 1876, Samuel Tilden, a white man, and Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate. And Tilden won the popular vote. And Tilden was the Democratic candidate, and the Democratic Party was the party of the Southern plantocracy. They weren't the only one. There were white people in the North and other places. In fact, in 1865, the Cincinnati Enquirer, I think it's called, ran an article that said, "Slavery is dead and the Negro is alive, and there lies the problem." In July of 1863, the greatest insurrection other than the Civil War happened in New York, where the white people didn't want to be conscripted into the army to fight in the Civil War. And they were opposed to the emancipation of African people, right? And it was the greatest insurrection short of the Civil War. Happened right here in July of 1863. So it wasn't just the draft riots they were characterized as. Whomever it was white folks who were opposed to black people going to fight in the Civil War and the emancipation of African people. They burned down the black orphanage in New York. So it wasn't just Southern white folk, and it wasn't just Southern Democrats, and the Democrats were not simply located in the South, but this was the party of the plantocracy. And so this issue of what was going to happen to white power in the South was a fundamental issue. Even up until that time, terror was being waged against African people during the Reconstruction to try to bust up Reconstruction. News papers and magazines wrote all kinds of slanderous articles all around the country showing Reconstruction governments, Africans in power as buffoons, and trying to demonstrate why white folk would be better off if there were no Africans in the government at all. And then the election came in 1876, and Tilden won the popular vote, and Tilden won the electoral vote. But what happened was 3 Southern Republican governors refused to accredit the electoral votes that the Democrats had won because the Republican governors claimed that they won those states through terrorizing and intimidating tens of thousands of African people and keeping us from being able to vote. All right? And then there was this huge crisis that emerged. Who was going to be the president? White folks was marching throughout this country screaming, "Tilden or blood." 11 years after the Civil War, Tilden or blood. This is what they were chanting. And there was even threats of civil war again in this country off that election, 1876. They were calling Hayes, whose name was Rutherford, they were calling him Rutherford Hayes. So they put together a commission, an electoral commission, to make a determination about who should get the electoral votes. And the Republicans rigged it. First, there were 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats and 1 independent. Then the Republicans who were in power gave the independent a job in the government and then replaced the independent with a Republican. So that their vote was 8-7 in favor of Hayes, and Hayes won the election. Got the election. Our friend, the Republican, was made president. But they had a situation just like this situation. Country split right down the middle. And the strategy then was same as it is now. The strategy to win the election was to negate the African vote as a political factor. And in order to govern, whoever got it had to make a deal with the other one. So they made a deal, the Republicans and the Democrats. It's gone down in history as the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. That's what it's called. White folks have to talk about it right now. They're having to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. I saw Garrett Utley, I think his name is, on television. And he was talking about how what has happened now is so similar to the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. And then he described the Tilden-Hayes Compromise as a deal that Hayes, who became president, made with Tilden, that he would not run for more than one time, and that he would put some Democrats in his cabinet. Oh no. The Tilden-Hayes Compromise was this: Hayes promised that if he became the president, if they allowed him to be president, he would pull the federal troops out of the South that were protecting the freedom of the African people who were there and ending the Reconstruction era. And he did exactly that. When Hayes pulled the troops out of the South, that reinvigorated the Ku Klux Klan. That's when the Ku Klux Klan took on a new dynamism that it has never experienced before. And terror against the African people became a way of life, so much so that thousands of Africans left the South. Some of you may be old enough to have seen the movie Buck and the Preacher with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, where Poitier played the role of this trail leader, trail boss, who was leading Africans from the South to other parts of the country. He went into Arkansas and Oklahoma and places like that, trying to get away from the terror in the South. That came as a consequence of the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. That ain't the only thing that came. Masses, the African lost our right to vote with the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. The Africans lost any kind of rights. That's where Jim Crow, that's where the so-called black codes came from. That's where this thing that caused segregation, that separate toilets and lynching and all of this came off the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. And it would be 1965. This happened in 1876. It would be 1965 before Africans in this country had the right to vote again. It would be 1964 before we had the right to just use public accommodations in this country again. That was off Tilden-Hayes. When you saw Martin Luther King marching and demonstrating in the South, he was marching against the consequence of Tilden-Hayes. Malcolm X, and he walked the streets of Harlem and throughout this country, it was against the consequences of Tilden-Hayes that he was moving against. The entire movement that we have been involved in for the last 100 and some odd years has been a movement against the consequences of Tilden-Hayes. So you've got this just very short window since we've been in this country. Do you understand what I'm saying? The Republicans were our friends, and they sold us out. Now we're Democrats. What you gonna do the next time? Become Republican? Now we're Democrats. And look at what has happened to us. It's 1965. Only 35 years. Now we've had the right to vote in this country. Just 35 years. Just 36 years ago, an African in this country was subject to be murdered just for stopping on the highway to pee. Just 36 years ago in this country, to try and register to join the Democratic Party would have your churches bombed and your babies killed in America. Not to join the Black Panther Party, but the Democratic Party right here in this country. And all of that was a consequence of Tilden-Hayes. And what did Tilden-Hayes do? It removed the federal troops that were supposedly here to protect African people from the former slave masters and the terror that white people brought us. 1965, the Voting Rights Act did what? Effectively, it was supposed to put the federal troops back again. It was to back up the right for African people to vote with federal troops, federal power. Isn't that what the Voting Rights Act was about? And look at what we have. Albert Gore just ran for president. And you want to talk about Florida and the significance of this campaign. You had all kinds of reporters from all around the world in Florida, watching this election. Albert Gore did not one time say, hey, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been violated and African people have been disenfranchised. Not one time. In fact, he would rather lose the election than raise the question of the freedom of African people. That was the issue. You had hundreds and thousands of Africans who would step forward and give the evidence of what had happened to us, but Gore couldn't raise the question. And he couldn't raise the question because he's afraid of the same thing that Bush is afraid of, and that's you. That's you in control of your own consciousness and recognizing what your own interests are. And both of them are afraid of that. How in the world can you have international media down in Florida? You heard of Palm Beach County. You heard some things about Palm Beach County. They say it's a pretty wealthy area, but they don't mention Belgrade in Palm Beach County. And they don't mention Pahokee and South Bay in Palm Beach County. And there's no media, no politician that could go to Palm Beach County and not see Belgrade, Pahokee, and South Bay, because the reality is those are African communities. And the truth is that the blacker the precincts were, the greater the number of votes that were thrown out. That's just mathematically the truth. So when you go into Palm Beach County, you run into Belgrade, which as long ago as 1989 was characterized as the AIDS capital of the world. It had a rate of AIDS infection that was 51 times higher than the national average. 12 times higher than in Kinshasa, the Congo, where white people say AIDS came from. And it didn't meet the profile of who the AIDS victim was supposed to be. They were all heterosexual, none of them were needle users, and 50% of them were women. You don't hear anything about that. 1989, a doctor who worked for the health department determined that if the AIDS thing was not turned around in Belgrade, Florida, that the African population would become extinct. You didn't hear anything about that. They didn't tell you how in Pahokee, they didn't tell you in Belgrade, Florida, 70% of all the people in the county jails in Belgrade were Africans. Or they didn't tell you how in Pahokee, where the people get their water from Lake Okeechobee, that the Environmental Protection Agency had to pass out bottled water 2 or 3 months ago because of the carcinogens, cancer-causing agents in Lake Okeechobee, coming from cattle waste, coming from the runoffs from the U.S. Sugar Corporation, and coming from the sewage from upper-class white people in West Palm Beach. But you don't hear about that, and guess what? That was true before the election, and it's going to be true after the election. So what does that mean for African people, for them to say that this contest is about the Democrats and the Republicans or Gore and Bush? I think that what we are looking at is a serious failure of African leadership. "35 years. We have a window of 35 years that African people were able to vote in this country. You're looking at a situation where since 1876 we've been struggling to overturn the consequence of Tilden-Hayes. And what has happened in Florida just demonstrated to us that it hasn't been overturned. And what just happened in the Supreme Court just demonstrated to us that it hasn't been overturned. And what is becoming clear to us is that you're looking at something that's in terms of its historical, in terms of its significance, in terms of its principle, it's on the equivalent of professional wrestling. Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Y'all know Rehnquist? Y'all know in 1962 when he was a lawyer in Arizona working for the Republican Party, that his job during the presidential election was to keep black people and Mexicans from voting? He did. In South Phoenix, they literally had to throw him out, literally had to pick him up and throw him out of a precinct because he was interrupting the ability of Africans and Mexicans to vote. That's Rehnquist, the Chief Justice, who just made some kind of decision about who should be the president in this country. And a decision that revolved around the fact that the whole African population had been disenfranchised in this country. That's what you're confronted with. We're looking at a failure of African leadership because white folk and the white ruling class are doing what they have always done. There is nothing unusual about what has happened. We've only had 35 years of the totality that we've been in this country that we've been able to vote. There is no tradition of democracy and freedom for African people in America. There is no tradition of such a thing. So then why would our leadership tell us that the solution is to join the Democratic Party? Listen to me. I'm not saying that somebody shouldn't vote or even that you shouldn't be a Democrat. What I'm saying is that that ain't your solution. You understand? And what we need to do is look for our solutions in ourselves. And that's why I'm glad to be in Harlem, New York on tonight, speaking to African folk. How you gonna solve a problem for the Democrats that don't even want the problem solved if it means your freedom? If it means your freedom, I'd rather not be the president. I'd rather give up my political future if it means the niggas got to be free. And how do we get in this position in the first place? Look at it. Look at the Clinton-Gore regime. This is the worst travesty that's hit the African community in I don't know how long. One of the reasons that Gore is in trouble in Florida is because Clinton and Gore have locked up all the damn Democrats. 1 out of every 10 African men in this country is in prison today. And if they were out of prison, who would they be voting for? Gore. More than 500,000 mostly African men cannot vote in the state of Florida because they have been convicted of felonies. Gore hasn't raised the question. Hell, Gore and Clinton made them felonies. You think I'm making it up? You remember when Clinton, who was an Arkansas cracker, look at what you got with Clinton. Y'all talking about the Republicans. Look at what you got with Clinton. Clinton ran for office, right? And he was going to break up this tradition because, you know, they used to not be able to elect a Democrat. Remember that? First they started killing them. Started killing them once they got elected, and then once they looked like they was going to get elected for a while, they was icing them. They were killing them in this country. And then what happened, of course, Carter sneaked through. And Carter sneaked through. Richard Nixon taught him how to do this. Nixon invented the so-called Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy was a strategy that recognized that the South was heavily Democratic, but it was also heavily white. And the issue became for the Republican Party to separate the white Democrats from their Negro allies. And so he ran a white platform, lily white platform, and Southern Democrats crossed over and elected Nixon. And then Carter, of course, became the first president in a long time to break that mold, and he was the only one. But how did Carter do it? He was also the first in a long time of what? Southern presidents. He was from Georgia. His brother, Billy Carter, is that his name? Bragged about being a George Wallace Democrat. Y'all remember that? His brother even had a public Ku Klux Klan meeting. And so Carter won the white people and got elected. Except Reagan came along and was whiter than Carter. And then since then, it's been hard for a Democrat to be elected president. Now, you get them defying all of the maxims of presidential politics. Usually when somebody runs for president, they get what they call a balanced ticket. They get a white man from one part of the country and then a white man from another part of the country in order to balance the ticket and pull people from those different sections of the country. But hell, in this one you had Clinton, a white man from Arkansas, and Gore, a white man from Tennessee. They were the whitest as you can be. And so you had the Democratic Party now using the Southern strategy, all right? And now they had to, you remember this thing they used to call the angry white male? And how they wouldn't vote for a Democrat because the Democratic Party was the party of the Negroes and Jesse Jackson? What happened was Clinton made it clear who the Democratic Party represented. And the first thing he did was attack black women and children. Said that he was going to kick people off welfare after 2 years. That was us. And all the white people knew it was us. And we knew it was us. Then he said he was going to put 100,000 police in the streets of America. That was us. And one of those cops stuck a stick up Abner Louima, and another one cut down Diallo here and killed Tyrone Lewis over in St. Petersburg, Florida. Those were Clinton cops. Clinton created the omnibus crime bill. That created 3 strikes you out. And all those other things that created 60 new applications for the death penalty in federal crime. Clinton did this. Clinton signed an executive order called One Strike You Out, so that women and children in housing projects, if somebody accused you of committing a crime, you don't have to be arrested or even convicted. If somebody accuses you of committing a crime, you can be evicted from the housing project. If they use that criteria against Clinton, him and Hillary will be homeless today. You understand? That's Clinton. Newt Gingrich didn't do that. Gingrich couldn't have got away with doing it. But what were you going to do? Because you were all hooked up in the Democratic Party and didn't have any place else to go. And then Clinton, when he was governor of Arkansas running for president, you remember he flew in to Arkansas, presided over the execution of this. They said he was a mentally retarded African, but it was worse than that. The brother had been lobotomized by a bullet. The front lobe of his brain had been shot off. He didn't even know where he was. When they asked him if he wanted his last meal, he said, save it for me for later. This is when they're going to kill him. And Clinton presided over that. Then Clinton went to Chicago, and he set up on a platform with Jesse Jackson. And on this platform with the Jackal, he attacked Sister Soldier, who had been there the day before, right? And attacking Sister Soldier was an attack on black youth who everybody loves to hate, and particularly African youth who are tied into the rap and hip-hop scene. That's what Clinton did. Then he gave Jesse Jackson an airplane and $1 million and told him to go out and register black voters for him. And Jackson did it. But he proved to all the white folk, Clinton did, that the Democratic Party was the party of white people. And that's how Clinton got elected president of the United States. And then Clinton and Gore escalated this attack on African people. Let me tell you something. You heard Gore and one or two of the other ones say how they were opposed to racial profiling. Hell, racial profiling ain't the problem. Listen to me. I saw them here in New York. After they killed half the black population, if they're not sticking sticks up them, they're shooting them using all the ammunition, killing folk, Dorisman, Diallo, and what have you. But I remember Clifford Glover. You understand? Here in New York, they're going to say, well, we're going to now put the killers in uniform. Well, hell, that's going to help a lot, isn't it? You know, give sensitivity training to them. Here is the contradiction, sisters and brothers. The contradiction is, in this country, there is a public policy of police containment of African people. In the 60s, it was policy, but it was not public policy. In the 60s, it was covert. We knew they was doing something to it, but they didn't say, this is what we're doing. They used the FBI, the CIA, covertly. It was always been policy, but today it is public policy. Everyone who runs for office runs against black people. They run on the promise of more jails, more police, more punishment, quicker use of the death penalty, kicking Africans off welfare, food stamps, and the rest of that. Do you understand? What we are confronted with is a public policy of police containment of African people throughout this country. And unless you deal with that basic public policy, yeah, they'll say, okay, we won't do racial profiling no more. Okay, we'll put this cop in uniform for you. But that doesn't deal with the issue. The issue is the basic public policy that manifests itself 1,000 different ways in the schools. Everywhere you look up, there's this policy, public policy of containing black people with the police. You see. And that's what in Clinton is the backbone. Clinton-Gore regime has done more than anybody. For example, between 1986 and 1996 in this country, there has been an increase in the numbers of folk, the percentage of folk arrested for so-called drug offenses, because you know that's the killer. They put it in your community. They put a drug economy in your community. Won't let the people work in the legal capitalist economy, then they create an illegal capitalist economy in your community, right? Worth a minimum of $250 billion a year. That they want you to believe some 17-year-old black male high school dropout living in the housing projects, right? Who they say can't do math, right? Created a laboratory, right? Where they discovered they could get this derivative crack from cocaine. Then this brilliant youngster created a network throughout Latin America, right? and then open up the ports of Houston, Texas, and Oakland, and San Francisco, California, and Tampa to bring all this stuff in, right? And when Eastern Airline was still existing, put it all behind the panels on Eastern Airline that was landing in these airports, right? Some black 17-year-old high school dropout living in the housing project was doing this. Because that's what we do when we get our hands on $250 billion, we move into the housing projects, right? So they put these drugs into our communities. And then they criminalize us because the drugs are in the community, right? And then they say they're making a war against drugs. But the drugs don't never go nowhere. Just the people keep disappearing. You understand? It's we who have a moral problem. Now, we don't have a new problem called crack. We got an old problem called cracker. But anyway, they put the drugs in our community, and it's been quite effective because the masses of people don't know where it comes from. They know we didn't put it there, but the people become demoralized because every time you look at a newspaper, they're talking about crack babies, crack mothers, and that's all you can see in the newspaper. And you start believing it yourself. They tell you about how much money the youngsters won't work because they're making all this money selling dope. Hell, the kid is wearing everything he owns. The gold chain, the gold rope, the car that he's in, and then white people let him stay out there until they get tired of him. Then they're going to put him in jail. They're going to take his gold. They're going to take his car and take his mama's house. Right? That's the way they do it. And then we walking around blaming ourselves for something. And now these Negro leaders, preachers, ministers, tell us that we got some moral deficit. We don't have good family values, and that's why it's in our communities. Ain't that something? So, just in Arkansas and Georgia, there has been between 86 and 96, a 5,000% increase in the numbers of drug arrests. African people, Africans, 5,000%. And in Louisiana, more than 10,000% increase. Clinton and Gore. We live right now, an 18-year-old African male. 76% of African men who are 18 years old will go to prison, if they live in urban centers, will go to prison by the time they're 36. 76%. This is what we are living with. You hear nothing from Gore. You hear nothing from Clinton. In fact, they put them there. And in fact, when you look at the state of Florida, which is one of 13 states where you lose your right to vote forever if you become a felon, right? Where at least 525,000 Africans cannot vote because they are felons. If you look at the state of Florida, if Gore had just raised the question of letting those Africans vote, if Gore and Clinton hadn't put so many Africans who are Democrats in prison, Gore wouldn't be in trouble, wouldn't have been in trouble in Florida. Because those are Democrats who are locked up in those prisons. So I'm just saying, brothers and sisters, that this gives us an excellent opportunity to sum up, to get ourselves together. And we should recognize that I was listening to a speech. I did a talk show about 3 weeks ago in New Hampshire, in Connecticut. And the brother played a tape, 35 years old, from Malcolm X. And Malcolm said on this tape, I can't remember, when he said it, when I heard the speech, I'd heard it 1,000 times. I can't remember which speech it was. It could have been the Ballad of the Bullet. And he said, 35 years or more ago, that the elections in this country are becoming so close that every time there's an election, they have to call for a recount. And he said that you are the deciding factor. Whatever way you go, that's the way the election goes. He said you have the ability to decide who goes to the White House or who goes to the doghouse. You understand? And Malcolm was right on time. That was 35 years ago that speech was made by Malcolm X. And of course it was right then, it's right now. But the problem that we have is that we don't even have control of our own vote. The Democratic Party has control of our vote. Gore has control of our vote. I mean, you had a situation where with all of what Clinton did to our community, you couldn't stop them Negroes from rushing down in a buck dance at his inauguration. You had more Negroes buck dancing at his inauguration, and all he had to do was put a few Negroes on his cabinet and give one Negro a plane and make him his African emissary, right? And that's all he had to do. He could commit all these other offenses against our people that everybody knew about, and then we go around apologizing for him, and some Negroes call him the first black president we ever had. That's criminal. That's a Negro that needs... So what I want to say is Malcolm was right then, and we need to be able to organize, and you should demand, like I shall, that our leaders need to start looking inward toward ourselves. And we need to have a strategy. Because what you're going to hear now, more of, you heard already, Negroes saying, well, we put all our eggs in one basket by joining the Democrats. I'm going to join the Republicans now, and because the Democrats just take us for granted. That's just a Negro doing his own thing, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. We don't need to be in a situation where we are functioning in these organizations as individuals because they take advantage of us as individuals. We need to create among ourselves a process wherein we create our own agenda and make everybody speak to our agenda as opposed to crawling on our bellies all the time behind one or another of them. We need to struggle for that. We need to create our own agenda. We African people, that's the struggle that we're involved in. I just want to say this finally, sisters and brothers, that the Democrats nor the Republicans are friends. And what we have to learn to do, and this is a terrible, terrible task, is to become friends of each other. Our struggle is to unite among ourselves. And it's a terrible task. It's a difficult task. And it's a difficult task because somebody's working 24 hours a day to keep us from doing it. I was on a talk radio show in Tampa, Florida. I made the same basic analysis about the Tilden-Hayes compromise that I'm making right now. And there was this important Negro sent by Clinton who was running all over the state of Florida, mobilizing African people in defense of Gore, having demonstrations and what have you. And this Negro called up the radio station that I was on to challenge me because I'm giving this announcement. He's saying, it doesn't matter. I don't care if it is just a facsimile of democracy. But I care now. If you don't care, you ought to care. What you mean you don't care? And the objective is to help the people to understand where the real contradictions lie so people can fight their way out of this mess and not just be crawling behind the Democratic Party. But that's what he said. And the last time I heard him, he was on the Tom Joyner show. He saw the handwriting on the wall. Guess what he was talking about? The Tilden-Hayes compromise. So you know who I'm talking about without even having to tell you his name, right? But I just want to say, sisters and brothers, that we have a lot of work ahead of us. And those of us who characterize ourselves as leaders, and you have to put pressure on us to struggle to find this unity that we must have in order to move forward. I want to express my deepest, most profound appreciation for your hospitality. And it has been magnificent, and I want to thank you for allowing me to be with you because I know I can get on a soapbox and get long-winded, and you've been so gracious. You've been... I just want to thank you so much, and I hope that I'm sure we have to work at having an opportunity to spend more time with each other, meeting each other in the trenches, because we got a hell of a struggle ahead of us. We do not know yet what deal the Democrats and Republicans are going to make, because they're going to have to make a deal in order to govern. Bush cannot govern without a deal. And I'm not here to tell you, I can't tell you that the deal is going to be as bad as Tilden-Hayes and the consequences of it. But you know what? I can't tell you that it won't be as bad as it was then. And the reason I can't tell you that it won't be as bad is because we are not organized to defend ourselves and to look out for our own interests. It is important that you have this front right here, this organization right here, this effort right here, this independent work going on right here. We have to do it everywhere, and we have to hook it all up together. Just want to say all power to the people and black power to the African community. Uru.
Brothers and sisters, I see some people here.